Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Disability Teaches Us, Reframing Possibilities, Meaningful Inclusion, Collective Action. So today's presentation is utilizing a meeting format. So it is not a webinar. This is a meeting/workshop. Card services are available. The chat feature is available. And we will use this for attendance check-in for clock hours if you're interested. And we'll also be using chat to respond to questions. And please note that private chat really truly isn't private. Facilitators can see the chat when the workshop is over. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see the chat button. You can select recipients. You can send messages to everybody, to the host or co-host. And again, this meeting will be recorded. It is being recorded. Our small breakout session that we'll have later on is not going to be recorded. And like I mentioned, we do have live remote cart services available today. For those folks who would like to view the captions, you can click on the Zoom menu toolbar and activate live transcript from the closed caption icon. If that doesn't work for you, you can also access captions from using a link, which will take you to a separate web browser. All right, so if you don't mind, please introduce yourself using the chat function right now. Again, just open up the chat, select everyone in the options, and you can share your name, your role, where you're located. That could be the city or the school district that you're in. And again, attendance is for clock hours. And we invite you just to take a moment to ground yourself and make this an accessible space for you. You are welcome to share video if you like, keeping in mind that individuals can see your video and we are recording. Also, if you're not speaking, please make sure to mute yourself. And yes, Jinju mentioned at the beginning for clock hours, please email her and she will get you set up for that. Thank you. All right, so we're going to introduce ourselves. My name is Jen Chang-Jul. My pronouns are she, her. I am a middle-aged woman of Korean and European descent. I have long, curly, wavy brown hair, brown eyes. I am the Director of Parent Training and Information at PAVE, and I'm also part of the Family Engagement Collaborative, part of the Inclusionary Practices Project. I am also a mother of a student receiving special education services. And disclaimer, he might pop in at any time. He's with me today, but that's okay. We'll just keep going. I do want to mention that the Family Engagement Collaborative team member, other members include Open Doors for Multicultural Families, Roots of Inclusion, and Education Northwest. And at this time, I'm going to pass it to Dinah.
Hi, everybody. I am Dinah Carl-Wilson. I'm one of the directors at Inclusion for All and also a parent of a disabled kid. And I am a white woman in my early 40s. I have a blonde bleached bob and I wear glasses, and I'm currently wearing a grayish top and I'm sitting in front of a very packed bookcase. And I'm gonna, my pronouns are she, her. I'm gonna pass it to Jinju.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jinju Park. I am a middle-aged Asian lady with shoulder-length purple hair and horn-rimmed glasses. I am sitting in front of a blue wall on a white sofa. I work for the Governor's Office of the Education Ombuds as one of the ombuds in the office. It's nice to meet you, and I'll let Jen launch our talk today.
All right, thank you. At this moment, I would just like to take a pause to do a land acknowledgement. So this afternoon, evening, we are taking a moment to honor America's first people and all elders, past, present, and emerging. And we are called on to learn and share what we learn about tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. In the area I live, I am on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. If you would like to participate in this acknowledgement, feel free to drop into the chat the traditional lands that you live. All right, and I'm going to also take one more moment to take a collective breath before we dive in. You know, in this moment in time in Washington State, it's the late afternoon of April 21st. And I just want to acknowledge that for anybody at any given time, there could be a lot happening in our lives that are impacting us greatly. And earlier, we asked you to identify yourselves and what your role you play. But truly, when we think about making things better for our young people, we know that nobody is identified. Nobody has one single identity or role. We are all in community, no matter what role we've taken on or that which has been assigned to us. So within us, together, we possess the tools to make things better for everybody. And I also want to take a moment to say that these topics around advocacy, disability rights, disability justice brings up a lot of strong emotions. And later on, we're actually going to be talking about some issues associated with identity. So we invite you just to have whatever tools you need to take care of yourselves this afternoon and evening, and know that our time really is an opportunity to learn and connect with each other. And sometimes we don't have closure at the end of a learning time. So taking a collective breath. All right, let's get to our learning goals. So we have a number of goals for our time together today. This includes examining the difference between individual advocacy and collective advocacy or activism, to situate inclusive education in the context of disability rights and civil rights of all children, to explore a new model for family advocacy based in collective activism, to begin the work of collaborative engagement with schools towards greater inclusivity, and to respond to our own call of action, where you as a participant get to define your next steps. And this is just a reminder that this is part of a series that's themed under Disability Teaches Us. And there's lots of resources for us that's available. Previous topics include disability justice in schools, listen and learn from youth. Our last webinar with Dr. Lavani, reframing possibilities, meaningful inclusion, not if, but how. And then today we're talking about collective advocacy. And again, this work is funded through the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction Inclusionary Practices Project. This is a project that began back in 2019 and is funded by our state legislature. In 2019, our state was one of the 10 least inclusive states in the nation. And while our state has made great strides in the last couple of years, we still remain in the bottom half of all national rankings when it comes to this area. So moving Washington towards a more robust and self-sustaining system of inclusion is going to take continued time and effort across all levels of the education system. And I'm going to take a moment to introduce our presenter today. And I'm just so thrilled that she is back with us. all the way from New Jersey in this virtual format. So Eastern time, it's much later for her than it is for us. Dr. Lavani is professor at Montclair State University. She teaches courses in disability studies and is the coordinator for graduate programs and inclusive education. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology. Her research is focused on examining the ways society and politics affects the experiences of individuals with disabilities and their families. Through her research, she seeks to confront ableism in schools, in society, and to highlight the problems with dividing students based on their abilities, which results in the widespread segregation of many students with disabilities in schools. She is the editor of Constructing the Mother, Narratives of Disability, Motherhood, and the Politics of Normal, and she's co-author of Undoing Ableism, Teaching About Disability in K-12 Classrooms. I would like to introduce Dr. Priya Lavani.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that lovely introduction. I am a South Asian woman sitting before a background of hummingbirds on the wall and plants behind me. I have black hair to my shoulders, and I'm wearing a black shirt and black glasses. Pronouns she, her. Should I get started, Jen? Okay.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'm delighted to be here again with this wonderful group. So because my work and my passion is around inclusive education, I'll start with what I use as my operational and working definition of inclusive education. I think I should note that this isn't the official or the definition of inclusive education. I guess it depends on whom you ask, and you'll get different results. I work with this definition, which is based in a disability justice and disability rights framework. And it is the philosophy and practice of educating diverse students in classrooms which are heterogeneous in terms of ethnicity, class, culture, gender identity, ability and disability, and other identity markers, using strategies that are responsive to each student's strengths and needs. And I mean, there's a few things that to me make this a rich sort of working definition. One thing that I like to point out is that it's both a philosophy and a practice. You can't have one without the other, right? And in this definition, we also see a really broad way of understanding inclusivity. It's not restricted to disability, but really it's about all forms of human diversity. And the third thing that I think that is notable about this definition is that it's a not inclusive education if we're not using strategies that are responsive to each student's strengths and needs. And I think that's where some of the problem lies, is when we sort of think of inclusive education as a place that we put students in, but really without the strategies, the effective strategies, it wouldn't technically have been inclusive education. So the other thing that I just want to situate it in is, and because I get this question a lot from parents, from the teachers that I work with, and people will ask me, is inclusive education the law? Is it mandated by law? Well, yes and no. Like the language of inclusive education doesn't actually appear in educational laws, which is, people know it as Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is now technically known as Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So people refer to it as IDEA still, which is fine. But the law actually doesn't use the language of inclusive education. However, the law does state that students with disabilities should be educated to the maximum extent possible alongside their non-disabled peers, and that removal may only occur when education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Now, what's remarkable here to me is that the second sentence begins with removal may only occur when, and that suggests that we are assuming that the first consideration then is the general education classroom. That's where we begin the conversation. That's where we should be beginning a child's placement. The law does not talk about working a child up to an inclusive setting. Rather, it assumes, as you can see, that the child is in a general education classroom and can only be removed if it's been tried and could not be achieved with the use of all the services possible.
Thank you, Priya. And I'm just going to take a moment to step in here and talk about Washington State data when it comes to this topic. So, you know, as mentioned before, Washington State is in the lower 10. In 2019, according to OSPI, prior to the pandemic, we ranked 44 out of 50 states for inclusive practices. And again, you know, to Priya's point, we're just talking about what really is the floor of opportunity, meaning being placed in the general education classroom. And so here on this slide, I have some data for you. LRE1 is designated 80 to 100% of the time. So in 2019, 57.7% of all students with IEPs were placed in general education settings. Also, if you disaggregate that a little bit more, 54.5% of students of color with disabilities were in those settings. LRE2 is 40 to 79% of the time. So 38.4% of all students with IEPs were placed in those settings. And when you disaggregate students of color, 31.1% of students of color with IEPs were in those settings. And then LRE3 is 0 to 39% of the time. So 12.4% of students with IEPs were placed in general education settings, and then 13.3% of students of color with disabilities were placed in those settings. So not only do we see, generally speaking, the floor of opportunity of students with IEPs, you know, very low as measured by LRE or least restrictive environment, but then going further, students of color with IEPs had less access also. And this is for students who are 5-year-old in kindergarten on up. I didn't have the preschool data available right now, but it's certainly, you know, much lower, much less access than this. Okay, pass it back to Priya.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And those statistics are very similar. Actually, New Jersey's probably a little bit worse. And it's interesting to note in the graphic that you just showed us earlier, it's almost like an inverse relationship, right? The more restrictive the place gets, the percentage of students of color seems to increase. So that's noteworthy. Okay, so I mentioned earlier when I was talking about my definition of inclusive education already that sometimes people tend to think of inclusion or inclusive education like, oh, we tried inclusion, but it didn't work. So we want to sort of take a moment to understand what perhaps conceptually we may be perhaps missing about this practice. often people tend to think of inclusive education or inclusion as a place, right? People say, oh, my son is in inclusion. I'm in the inclusion, I teach in the inclusion class. So we want to start looking at inclusive education, not as a place or as a noun. I like to say, no, it's not a noun, it's really a verb. Really, to include is an action. You have to do something. Students with disabilities are entitled to access in the general education curriculum and the classroom. However, simply placing a child with a disability in a general education class is inclusion in name only. It doesn't make it inclusive education. We need to think about what has been done in terms of the environment, in terms of the physical space, in terms of the materials being used, in terms of the schedule, in terms of the ways in what are the language expectations and the communication expectations, what is the curriculum, and so on and so forth. So true inclusive education is where the classroom, the curriculum, the environment has been set up to meet the needs of all of its students instead of the other way around. The student doesn't need to fit an already created program. Instead, we need to think about how the program, and inclusive education usually does require a restructuring and a rethinking of the practices and the spaces. So some of what's happening in schools and in the ways in which we're thinking about all of this may be rooted in something called ableism. Many of you might be familiar with that term. If you're not, I'll take a moment to just maybe explain what it is a little bit. Ableism refers to negative attitudes towards or devaluing of individuals with disabilities. It's a way of thinking, if you will, where disability is perceived as a wholly and entirely and unequivocally negative, undesirable way of living and being, something to be removed, eliminated, fixed, remediated, and normalized. So an easy way to think of it is it's like the other isms, right? Racism, classism, sexism, and so forth. And like the other isms, it unfolds as a pervasive system of oppression at three different levels, like all of them, at the individual level, at the cultural level, and most problematic and most damaging is at the institutional level, because that involves policies and laws and so forth. It results in a lack of access and a preference for non-disabled ways of learning and moving and communicating. And when you think about it in the context of schools, think about ableism and the ways in which we've set up schools, right? We've created a system where the expectations of movement, of communicating, of learning, how will teaching be delivered? How will instruction be delivered? What is the expectation of learning and what is the expectation of demonstrating mastery? All of that is set up to the advantage of some people, maybe of the majority, granted, right? Non-disabled people. So we've created a system that works for non-disabled people. Sometimes it doesn't even work for all people. And then we are trying to accommodate those whom it doesn't work for, instead of creating it in the first place in a way that could reach a wider range of students. So I'm gonna move a little bit to this connection between inclusive education and families. There's a wide breadth of research out there, and it's research that I am involved in as well, but very broad literature based for the last, I would say, 3 decades, points to the same thing, and not much has changed over the past 3 decades. In the literature, in the research, we find that decisions pertaining to students' placement in inclusive education are likely to have been parent-driven. In other words, families, parents, advocate, fight the fight, as often families call it. And chances are very high that if a child, particularly a student with an intellectual disability or labels of autism, multiple disability, if they are in an inclusive setting, chances are that it was because of the advocacy of their parents. So this parent advocacy, some people here are parents, I saw in the chat, and a lot of my work, in fact, a large portion of my work is with families and parents and parent workshops and parent advocacy research. So parent advocacy, we hear about it a lot these days, but I want to just put that in a historical context. This is not a new thing. This is not something people think, oh, wow, why are so many parents needing to advocate these days? There is a very long tradition of family advocacy, except that there's a difference. In the 60s and 70s, family advocacy took a different form. They were very grassroots family movements. Instead of individual advocacy, families banded together. They worked collectively with people with disabilities and allies. And many times it was families and their work and their collective activism and advocacy that has led to many of our present laws and legislative changes, such as, for example, PL 94-142, which today we know as IDEA. So all that hard-won wars, I like to say, but 4 decades later, where are we? Still, students with disabilities continue to be marginalized in schools. Special education continues to operate based on a fundamental ideology of separate but equal, which is sanctioned by the law and is upheld in many school systems as the norm. And not only that, it is upheld as an appropriate and good way of educating children. Ability-based grouping, and for those of you who may not understand what I'm saying, the simple practice of segregating or sorting children based on their functioning levels or their ability levels or their ability to perform academically, and placing them in separate settings based on that is sanctioned, as I said, and upheld in the school systems. And many families continue 4 decades later to fight for their children's right to an inclusive education. So why is this happening still, right? I mean, we could go on all night. The answers are not in this slide alone, right? There's many ways of approaching what's going on with the situation today. But some of it is, we have to look at the laws itself. So many parents are very empowered, able, knowledgeable, and even in that group, right? I'm saying even in the most privileged, knowledgeable group of parents, some of you are here. I forgot to say, I also am a parent of a child with a disability now, has graduated from the school system. So I should position myself as well as a parent who has been through the system and has had to be an advocate for inclusive education. So many parents believe that they must perpetually fight for their children's rights to inclusive education. And the problem may really be at a structural level, right? For one, there's a fair amount. I mean, IDEA is a progressive law. It was a great thing that happened. I mean, prior to that, honestly, children with disabilities had no right to a public education at all. So the intent of IDEA, back then it was Public Law 94-142, its intent was progressive. It was to increase access, right? It was based in disability rights. But as the law sort of got written, people have critiqued it. For one, there's a fair amount of ambiguous, subjective language. For example, children with disabilities are entitled to a free and appropriate public education, right? You can see which word there lends itself to interpretation, right? Free, I get. Appropriate is anybody's guess how you want to interpret that. And there's many places in the law itself which sort of, there are pockets where loopholes are built in. People have argued that the loopholes are built into the law. So parents are, on the one hand, empowered in the laws to be equal partners, right? To be a member of the IEP team. Yet, we, as a special education system nationally, we are functioning on a deficit-based model. And what do I mean by that? The system is based in identifying the things in the child that need to be fixed, right? And that, when you think about it, that's the model. We have to look at what needs to be improved in the child. That's the whole point of special education. We have the objectives, we have the goals, we measure it because the kid has this problem and this is where they need to get. Instead of thinking about it the other way, it is not based in a system which problematizes the practices itself. It only problematizes the deficit in the child, and the remedy is to remedy the child. Many disability rights scholars have actually made an argument that the LRE continuum stipulation in the law, the least restrictive environment continuum, which many laud as a wonderful sort of way of placing children where they belong. But there's been much argument made that the continuum itself was a legal loophole that was baked into the law. So de jure segregation of children with disabilities is in the law. For other groups, we continue to be a society that segregates children in schools, not just by disabilities, by the way, also by race, right? Even though racial segregation is not legally sanctioned, people argue. And I'm not a legal person, by the way, but my understanding of de jure and de facto segregation. De facto segregation is when it's not legally sanctioned, but it ends up happening anyway, right? And that is the case of racial segregation in schools. It's not legally sanctioned, right? After Brown v. Board of Ed. However, because of residential zoning, people go to neighborhood schools. What ends up happening is that America's schools continue to be largely racially segregated. So that's what we call de facto segregation. Not okay by law, but we still end up doing it. Now with disability, it's a different matter. It's not only de facto, but it's de jure, which means the law supports it. It's okay for this one group. The law legally upholds that in some cases, some children can be educated in entirely segregated settings. So this slide comes from a couple of research studies that I've done with mothers over the years. And it's interesting that actually I should say parents, not just mothers, but these studies are with moms and dads. So when I interview and talk to parents, often about their advocacy for inclusive education and their experiences, I started to realize that they identify themselves in certain ways. In other words, first of all, their advocacy for inclusive education becomes part of their identity. It becomes a part of who they are after a while. Right? It becomes inseparable from their parenting. And interestingly, many parents in the studies that I've done refer to them in ways that suggest that they are aware of how they are viewed by school professionals, right? So many of them say that, the schools probably hate me. They know I'm trouble. And in that, they sort of demonstrate an understanding that they are viewed by school professionals in negative ways. Next slide, Jen. And there's 3 different categories of identities that I have found with parents who advocate for inclusive education specifically. So one I call the squeaky wheels, right? So this is a group of parents that believe that they are tolerated by professionals. They are not viewed as partners, but rather just tolerated. This group of parents understands themselves to be in adversarial relationships with professionals. They also believe that their view of education for their children is at odds with the opinions of professionals. They believe they must be constantly vigilant. And I get this a lot. All of the quotes are directly from the narratives of parents, by the way. They believe that if they make enough noise, right? So that's why I call them the squeaky wheels. They make enough noise, they may get the resources. Among this group of parents, their advocacy occasionally yields results. At other times, these parents continue to feel at a loss and frustrated because they feel like they're not getting anywhere. Second group of parents I call the mothers from hell, and many of them actually refer to themselves in that way. And this name, actually, it's interesting. It comes from, I think it's a New Jersey-based. There was a nonprofit organization actually called Mothers from Hell, and I don't know if it's actually still up on the web, but you can check it out. I may be wrong, but I think it was a New Jersey-based group. They called themselves Mothers from Hell, and it was a parent advocacy and in education empowerment sort of forum. And it's interesting to me that this group of parents, they claim this title for themselves. This group of parents resist, they push back, they try to highlight problematic policies and practices. They may become involved in developing setting up organizations at the local level, establishing parent groups, educating other parents, trying to change policies in their own district. They believe that inclusive education placement is driven by their resistance, and they believe that inclusive education is a civil right. So there's this group, and then there's the third group that we call the CEOs of the IEP. And that name also came from a narrative of a mother that I spoke to, and she referred to herself as the CEO of the IEP. And that became sort of the name that I've used for this group of parents. This is a group that believe that they lead the process. They have become entirely disillusioned. They believe that if it weren't for them, their children would not be educated inclusively. They have sort of removed themselves from any expectation of equal partnership. They are mistrustful, and they perceive their own role to be the most critical in all decisions. And it's sad when this is the work that I've done with families over a decade, right? And you see this level of anxiety and frustration and disenfranchisement, and it's a very palpable, the kind of toll that this kind of thing takes on families.
Thank you, Priya. And at this time, I'd like us to just pause, and maybe we can take a poll to see with our participants if any of these descriptions resonate with you. And Jinju is going to launch a poll, which you can respond to, and we'll take a look at the results.
There. So I don't think I got the poll for some reason. I have a survey, but not a poll.
Okay. Oh, I see something popped up on my end.
Ah, yes.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so for folks, if you don't mind just taking a moment to respond and go ahead and check off which one resonated, or maybe all of them actually resonated. You've moved through all of those kind of identities, or maybe none of them did. So go ahead and take that poll and give it a minute.
I think these are all very negative in their tone, so I would say none. Is there a positive one?
Oh, wow. Well, that's such a great question. In my decade of research with parents who are struggling to access inclusive education for their child, it has been a rare moment that a parent has not said that they've had to fight for inclusive education, particularly when, so yeah, I wasn't able to come up with a cluster of parents that that made a critical mass enough to make a an outcome of the research.
I use the term mama bear
Mm.
because I see that as a positive. You're strong, you're fierce, but you're not, you're going to fight for your kid. But I'm also a school professional. I'm a mom of a kid with a disability, but I'm also a school professional. So I'm on both sides of the table. And it's hard to know how parents don't really know how to be part of that team and to be a strong advocate without being a pain in their butt. You want to be respectful and you want to be respected. And as a mom, I've experienced being shut out and disrespected.
Yeah, those are great points. So first, I just want to clarify these. So these terms are not mine. These are the terms that mothers refer to themselves as. And by the way, they are not referring to themselves as these things. They are saying that they've reclaimed these names because they believe that that's how they are viewed by professionals. In other words, a lot of mothers talk to me and say, oh, they think I'm the mother from hell. I know they talk about me. So and I also work with teachers, and I have a separate body of research with teachers. And I actually, by the way, asked them, because I do it back and forth, what do you think of mothers who advocate for inclusive education? And lo and behold, Ruth, I do get, oh, they, are just always asking for a lot of things. They're, constant. They just go on and on and on and on. So you get a really interesting. So my point here is that these mothers have claimed a title for themselves, not that they aren't naming themselves that. They're saying that this is how they know they are talked about by the school system. And so they claim that title in resistance. And also, just to clarify, these are parents who specifically are fighting for inclusive education. I am not talking about all parents. And I know parents refer to themselves as mama bears as well, but rarely when they are fighting for inclusive education. In that context, it's an exhausting process that leaves them feeling these ways more often than not. If that explains a little bit.
Yeah,
We
thank
look like
you,
we've
Priya.
got some poll results here.
Yes, we do. And I'm noticing that I think maybe we didn't have CEOs on there, but that's okay. There were 53% actually identified with all of those. 13% said, well, none of these really resonated. And then others said squeaky wheels and mothers no resonated. So there you go.
I want to say that there's an underlying assumption of being adversarial. It's us versus them, rather than being cohesive as a team and having mutual respect. I don't know if, I see that, people kind of have an attitude in one or the other, whether we are working together, trying to get a good working relationship, or are we adversaries? And I don't think the adversarial is very beneficial.
Totally, it's not. But just also, I'll put out there that almost every kid that I've worked with who's in a general ed classroom, if they have either a label of intellectual disability, developmental disability, autism, or multiple disability, they are only there because the parent had to advocate for it, is the polite word, but fight for it is what they would say. So it becomes adversarial because they shouldn't have to fight for it. It's already the child's right. And so this is a journey that has left these parents depleted, trying to fight, I put in quotes, for something that is already, by the way, their child's right and is being denied to them. It's hard to it's so complicated, but I really appreciate this. Sorry, let me turn off my phone. Okay. Yeah, so let's go to this. So fighting, and I again put that in quotes because that is one word that comes up very frequently, in addition to other words like battle. When families talk about their journey of trying to seek inclusive education for their child, it is frequently, if not always, described in the language of a battle. And I work with parents who over years and years trying to access their child's right to being in a general education classroom. This fight, as they call it, is stressful and requires immense amounts of resources. Parents have to rely on large amounts of cultural capital and economic capital often, if it's available to them. Sorry. I'm just going to turn this off. So parents rely on the cultural and economic capital available to them to secure an appropriate education for their child. Inclusive education, then, one can see, is going to be linked with socioeconomic privilege, right? Because if parents are relying on cultural and economic capital, then we have to really think about how does this work? Parents who have the resources available to them are able to get, and not all, even in that group, are able to get access for their child into inclusive settings. And this, when we go back to Jen's slide earlier about the national data, actually also shows that self-contained settings tend to be largely, they tend to largely house children of color, linguistic minorities, and children of lower SES group. That's a statistic that bears out almost in every state and also in the national statistics. So you can see how it's playing out and perhaps why it's playing out, because there's parents of privilege who are advocating for inclusive education, which then leaves parents who have less privilege, whose children are left in self-contained settings. So while I've talked about family advocacy and its historical roots and how parents advocate and need to advocate, I'm now going to switch gears a little bit and problematize that very family advocacy, right? Because while it has yielded results and it's undoubtedly required for individual children, it's also necessary for us to recognize that the advocacy itself may be contributing to the problem. So three problems with family advocacy. One is what I call battle fatigue. Yes, I'm back to the battle metaphor, Ruth. So yeah, I think is there going to be a slide where we talk about it in greater detail, or maybe I'll talk about it now, Jen? So
yeah, you could talk about it now, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So battle fatigue, by that I mean that families put in the amount of emotional drain that goes into advocating for inclusive education is draining emotionally and psychologically for families. And I said it's also draining, resources, financially, of course. So that leads us to the second problem, which is, if that's the case, then who's advocating and who's not advocating? Because if you need this level of resources, time, effort, energy, language, people, and money to get your child access to an inclusive setting, then only those who have the most resources will even be able to take that on, leaving, other families and the children of those families even further marginalized than before. And the third problem is that when families advocate for their individual child, and I'm not putting the blame on families who do that, because I get it, and I'm a parent who's advocated for their child, right? If your child needs resources, or you're going to advocate for your child. However, that's only going to change maybe the situation for that child. What it's not going to change is it's not going to change the system. If anything, it's been argued that the individual advocacy is actually a good thing institutionally, because then the institutional policies don't have to change. You can just respond on a one-by-one basis to the families who make the most noise. And it's easier than actually making structural and systemic change. So here's where we need to be moving. And in more recent years, I've been working on something that I call a new initiative that's called From Advocacy to Activism. And it's really sort of a way of thinking where we start to realize families, as I said before, have a historical tradition of grassroots activism. That's where this group of people began the story, right? But somewhere along the line, we've gotten lost. We started with grassroots activism to change systems, and we changed systems. We changed laws. We worked for legislative change. We have IDEA today in part because of the work of families and allies and disabled activists. But somewhere along the line, it's become this thing where families are advocating for their child, which I get why families would need to do that. But we need to sort of get back to focusing on institutional structures and practices, work collectively and collaboratively with school systems with a sense of shared responsibility, right? Because in the previous slide, remember who's advocating and who's not. I think we need to think about what about the children whose families do not have the resources to advocate for them. We need to start looking at this as a collective and shared responsibility, and start to aim for broad systemic responses that can affect broader range of students, not just our own children. So 3 steps toward that. The first step, of course, is making a mind shift. That's always required in inclusive education, in systemic change, in social justice, right? All social justice and civil rights work has to start with a mind shift. And I have to also say, it's not on this slide, but I say this to my students, it always starts with a sense of discomfort. We've got to start feeling something is not right, and maybe I'm complicit in it. I talk about this a lot in my classes with my students. I strongly believe that all social change necessarily begins with grappling with discomfort, with uncomfortable feelings, or an understanding of where we are in this ecosystem and how we are complicit in it, all of us. So we need to make that mind shift, and then we create a space for parents, caregivers, educators to work together to understand inclusive education as a practice related to democracy. Okay, you can't have a democratic society. We can't talk about democratic, equitable, socially just societies if we're not willing to look at the ways in which we've set up schools. That is not a precursor to a democratic society. we need to understand that there is a solid connection between social justice education and the need to confront all forms of segregation. And self-contained classrooms are a form of segregation. We need to gain an understanding about inclusive education as a civil right. We need to learn about that first. And then we need to create a space for collective, positive engagement, families and educators, towards targeted and systemic policy changes. Then we have step 2, which is providing individuals with language and tools, right? And again, and this means teachers, educators, and families as well. I'm a teacher educator. I work with educators every day. And all of my students are already in-service teachers. They have come back for their advanced certification. And it would be, it's alarming to me that each day I realize they're in-service teachers, but they never really understood inclusive education, IDEA laws, and often they're very surprised when they learn some of the more intricate aspects of what is in the law and what practices are happening at their schools. So we need to give people the language to understand it in the first place. And then we need to give people the language to understand and disrupt ableism and ableist discourses and practices. It's all very well to say, oh, ableism, and but what is it? What are all these ableist practices, and how do we address it? We should be able to name it, and we should know, and we should invite children also, not just educators. But the main thing is, how can we as educators invite children at developmentally appropriate levels, parents alike, the way you talk to your kids and teachers and educators? How do we invite children to understand issues of justice, of disability justice, of fairness, of equity, and what it means? What does it really mean to be a community of belongingness? Let's talk about this. Who are we leaving out, kids? And why? And what do you think? And I think beautiful things happen. I've worked with children in schools on anti-ableism. And when you position them, throw it at them, it's beautiful what comes out from them. Let them do the work, but you have to give them the language first, and the knowledge and the ideas, and then let them really do the work with you and position themselves as agents of change. So yeah, so that's the third step, right? So you've learned the laws, you've grappled with your own discomfort, you've grappled with your complicity, you've understood the language, and now you are positioned to become an agent of change. The value of collective activism is beautiful and goes well beyond individual advocacy. And working alongside systems is indeed a better way than working as adversaries, right? So we need to have dialogue on inclusivity at the district level, but in a way that we are able to engage and invite all families, because remember, not all families are at the table. They may not be at this Zoom session either. And that's what we need to ask ourselves. It's one thing that we're here and we're talking about it, but who's not here? And why? And how can we, those who are able to be at the table, what the two things they can do is first try to increase the number of seats at the table and consider ways to get people to remove the obstacles so that more people can be at the table. And number two, to do the work, even for those who are not at the table, so that the work that we are doing can impact a broader range of students.
Thank you, Priya. And I think, at this point, I'm just going to stop and we're going to talk about the Washington context as it relates to these different steps. So, in the beginning, you remembered I talked about how this project started in 2019. And really, as the state legislature funded this was, part of the activism of families indeed, families, communities, talking to their legislature about what is happening and not happening with their children in school. And then also, having that huge discomfort about where we are situated as a state in serving our students with disabilities, and then also their post-secondary outcomes. So we have the data on there that really show disparate outcomes for our students who leave our public education system, and they're not going and having the outcomes that other students are having. And then when you disaggregate that even further, again, it's, students of color with a disability, students of color with a disability who also happen to be English learners have far less opportunities when they leave our system. So that generated the funding of, roughly, what was it, $37 million over 4 years to change those things. So at this time, I wanted us to have a moment to kind of sit and absorb what we just heard and what we all might be thinking, and then also give us the opportunity to network and to share with, share with each other what we know. Because sadly, what in my circles, I find that actually a lot of families don't know about the Inclusionary Practices Project. They don't know if their district's involved or even their school, what's happening. So this is our opportunity to connect and share information. And what do you know about the project? Do you know anything about your district's involvement or your school? So we're going to give you just a breakout activity and there's not a ton of us here, but we can maybe have just a couple breakout rooms to introduce ourselves to each other, to say hi, where are you from, what do you know? We'll drop in the link. I see Dinah's already done that. A link that you could go to the Inclusionary Practices Project page on the OSPI website. There's actually a map. A lot of folks don't even know about this. There's a map that kind of like demonstrates what districts are involved. Where are the pilot schools? Where is activity going? And this could, this is definitely information that families need to have. So I think at this point, Jinju is going to set up some breakout rooms for us, and you'll have the opportunity to click a blue button that says, join a breakout room. And we'll just take, I'm looking at the clock, maybe, 8 minutes to just share information and connect. And then we'll come back and share what we learned. So Jinju. All right, welcome back, everyone. I think we're back. Good to see you. I hope you had some time to connect and talk with each other. I think that's just also part of the work is, the networking and the relationship building that needs to happen. So we're a smaller group. So I'm going to say, if you don't mind, in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, is there something that you learned that you would like to share out with everybody else based on your conversations? Did you know about the IPP? Are you interested in all of that? So yeah, let's chat in the chat or by unmuting. And I understand like practicing wait time is actually a strategy. So happy to wait. Dinah, do you see anything in chat?
Yes, here's a comment from Jerry that IPP projects may be missing their mark in areas where they are opening programs in, air quotes, that aren't creating full inclusion. For example, a quote demonstration site that is offering preschool positions that aren't equitable to the fee-based offerings for typical children. So clearly some birthing pains.
Anyone else want to share what they learned?
And another comment about systems change and how slow it is. So hearing from others how those changes seem they won't come soon enough for their child to benefit. And sometimes change is indeed glacial. But it's still change. Tough balance.
As folks are maybe thinking or thinking about what they might offer, I also want to, I think we at this time we can open up the floor to any questions, you know, that people might have for Priya based on what was shared today, or, you know, any questions about data that was presented. I think I could help with that. Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming back together and doing some sharing. Again, we talked about steps towards collective change, which includes making the mind shift, learning about disability rights, disability justice, learning about ableism, providing individuals with language and tools. So not only learning about the laws, but maybe looking at the tools we currently have. And in the Washington context, we actually have quite a few tools. In the chat box, you'll notice that the Family Engagement Collaborative has a community conversation toolkit to get these type of conversations going in your local community. And step 3, you know, once you have that mind shift and you have some tools, then becoming empowered and organized as agents of change. So joining voices, because understanding that our humanity, all of our humanity is connected to one another. And really, you know, all of these things are linked to all the isms, racism, ableism, they're all linked. So when we can see that and have a collective voice of disrupting that and changing that, we can move forward. So, you know, as we're getting ready to call out, you close out in the chat, you can just maybe drop in one thing that you're going to do, what you're set to do as a action. Maybe you're going to check out some tools and check out the Inclusionary Practices Project website. Maybe you made connections in our time together and you're going to follow up with that person with an email or a text. So go ahead and drop those in the chat if you don't mind. Like what, based on what you learned this evening, what are some next steps that you're going to take? And then you'll have the opportunity to look at everybody's responses as we do that. We did take some questions for Priya, so thank you. And I want to highlight some really great references, you know, based on, you know, a lot of what Priya shared and all her research. She provided just a plethora of things that you can utilize to help you with a mind shift and to learn more. And also, there's just more resources there, more references as well. Especially connected to Dr. Lavani's work. We also have the links to the OSPI Inclusive Practices Project, the Family Engagement Collaborative. Washington Ed for All is another site of information that is designed for educators. And then we have what is called the Educational Justice Roadmap that our Teachers Union and the NEA, National Education Association, funded. That's a good resource to check out. And again, you know, this is about mind shift and how we're all impacted. Whether you have a child, a loved one with a disability or not, you know, their experiences in our public education does impact everybody's education for sure. The other thing that you can also do, I see Jinju dropped this in the chat, or maybe it was Dinah. We have one more opportunity with Dr. Priya. That's actually next week. So this next week is Meaningful Inclusion, Undoing Ableism in Schools. That'll be April 28th at the same time, and we'll go deeper in the school context. How do we actually undo ableism? And again, if you are an educator who needs Washington clock hours, you can please email Jinju. Her email is here on the slide, but it's also will be provided in the chat. She will send a form for you to fill out, and will confirm your attendance through Zoom. And again, of course, your next opportunity is to join us for our third workshop in this series with Dr. Priya. And so these are two great quotes that Dr. Priya provided. I don't know, do you want to read them?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, they're two of my favorites. Inclusive education is an assumed precondition for a democracy, by Basil Bernstein. And Judge John Jerry in Oberty versus Board of Education stated, inclusion is a right, not a special privilege for a select few. And in next week's Undoing Ableism, I'm going to go into a lot of language and discourses in schools and actual practices that will provide us with that tools and language, and how we can sort of disrupt those and invite children to disrupt those, like actual strategies for that.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Again, in the chat, there's a survey or evaluation for you to fill out. Feel free to do that, please, and reach back out to us if you want any of the resources or you have additional questions. And we're just so thankful that you came. And I'm really thankful to Dr. Lavani, because it's so late on the East Coast right now, but I'm so thrilled that you were with us. It's a great learning tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yes, it's late, but it's also my favorite topic. So.
All right. Thank you so much.
Great being with all of you.
Yeah. So goodbye, everyone. We really appreciate you. Thank you for coming. Have a good evening.